Hi, welcome back everyone. I hope you belum menyampah lagi tengok muka I. And now we move on to gene testing. Okay, so what is gene testing? So gene test, also called DNA-based test, is the newest and most sophisticated of the techniques used to test for genetic disorders. It involves direct examination of the DNA molecule itself. Other genetic tests include biochemical tests for such gene products as enzymes and other proteins, and for microscopic examination of stained or fluorescent chromosome. So genetic tests are used for several reasons, including carrier screening, which involves identifying unaffected individuals who carry one copy of a gene for a disease that requires two copies for the disease to be expressed. Like in Malaysia, sebelum kahwin you kena buat test for apa tu? I lupa lah. But there's thalassemia, is it? Yeah, but there's a test that you have to do beside HIV test. So there's a test that you have to do to know whether you are a carrier. So that when you know if you are the carrier, then kalau pasangan you pun is a carrier, then there's a possibility that your kids will be affected by that disease. So you can make decision whether you want to carry on marrying that person or maybe you want to marry somebody else who is not a carrier. So this is what genetic testing can do for you. And we also have pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which means the embryo screening before the baby is born. And prenatal diagnostic testing, the amniocentesis, we will talk about this later. We also have newborn screening, pre-symptomatic testing for predicting adult onset disorders such as Huntington's disease that we discussed earlier. So we can also test whether we have the genetic defects for this disease. And also pre-symptomatic testing for estimating the risk of developing adult onset cancers and Alzheimer's disease. Also to confirm diagnosis of a symptomatic individual. Sometimes you have symptoms of a disease but you're not sure whether you have that disease. So genetic testing can make a confirmed diagnosis. We can also use genetic testing for forensic or identity testing. Like if you watch CSI or other crime investigation, if a body is not easily recognized, so we can use the DNA to know who is that individual. So how does it work, this genetic testing? So scientists scan a patient's DNA sample for mutated sequences. A DNA sample can be obtained from any tissue including blood. So kadang-kadang kita guna rambut. So any tissues lah can be used. For some types of gene tests, researchers design short pieces of DNA called probes, whose sequences are complementary to the mutated sequences. So probe ni usually are labelled with apa-apa lah yang kita boleh nampak that we can see, either radioactive or colours. And if it appears, then maknanya you have that mutated gene. So these probes will seek their complement among the 3 billion base pairs of an individual gene. If the mutated sequence is present in the patient's genome, the probe will bind to it and flag. And it will be flagged. So kita boleh nampak. Another type of DNA testing involves comparing the sequence of DNA bases in a patient's gene to a normal version of the gene. And cost of testing can range from hundreds to thousands of dollars depending on the sizes of the genes and the numbers of mutations tested. Okay, so this is how you find that mutated genes. So to find a target gene mutation in a sample of DNA, scientists use a DNA probe. So this is a DNA probe. A length of DNA probe there. Okay, a length of single-stranded DNA that matches part of the gene and is linked to a radioactive atom. So the single-stranded probe seeks and binds to the gene. Radioactive signals from the probe are then made visible on the X-ray film. So if we see it on the X-ray film, then that means you have that mutation. So what are the pros of this genetic testing? What are the goodness of it? So one thing is it can be used to clarify a diagnosis. So like if you have the symptoms but you don't know why you're having that symptoms. So if you do a genetic test, then it might clarify the diagnosis, and then it might clarify what disease do you have so that you can have proper treatment. And then to direct a physician towards appropriate treatments, like I said. So if you know what your problem is, then you can probably find the solution. It can also allow families to avoid having children with devastating diseases. So macam saya cakap tadi lah, if you dah buat testing with your partner before you kahwin, and then you know that your future partner ni might have a certain disease, so maybe you might want to cancel the marriage and marry somebody else. I don't know, maybe. To identify people at high risk for conditions that may be preventable. So macam phenylketonuria yang we discussed earlier. So if we know that our kids will have that, then we can prevent them from drinking those that will cause that disease lah. And then it will provide doctors with a simple diagnosis, such as the common iron storage disease, transforming a usually fatal condition to a treatable one. So when we know what your disease is, maybe we can prevent death from occurring. How about the cons? Usually everything will have its goods and bads. So what are the cons of genetic testing? So there might be difficulty in interpreting a positive result because some people who carry a disease-associated mutation never develop the disease. Yeah, that's one of the problems. Sometimes it's also depending on your environment. Sometimes you have the genes, but you might not develop the disease. So mungkin itu ketentuan Tuhan jugalah, kan, kita tak tahu. And there's also possibility for laboratory errors. This might be due to sample misidentification, contamination of the chemicals used for testing, or other factors that could possibly lead for laboratory errors. For example, mana tahu ada yang tertukar sampel ke sampel orang lain yang memang ada penyakit, tiba-tiba dia tertukar dengan you, sebenarnya you tak ada penyakit pun. Tapi sebab dah tertukar, tahu-tahu you dapat result, you ada penyakit, lepas tu you dah sedih-sedih apa semua, tiba-tiba hospital call balik, you tak ada penyakit. Macam mana? Rasa best. And it can also provoke anxiety and risk for discrimination and social stigmatization. So for example, macam yang case of having genes that could lead to extreme criminal behaviour tu kan. If you know, kalau lah you tahu jiran sebelah rumah you ada genetik tu, walaupun dia selama ni baik je, hantar makanan, hantar kek, hantar roti, hantar apa, tapi dia ada gene tu. So would you still feel safe? being next to them, to that person, atau you akan rasa anxiety, takut, and then you pergi bagi tahu pula kat jiran sebelah sana, kata gini tak boleh ni, bahaya ni, nanti kan dia bunuh kita ni, kita tak tahu dia punya genetik ni macam mana nak trigger kan. So this genetic testing, if could lead to this kind of social stigmatization and discrimination. So one of the cons of genetic testing. Okay, ni amniocentesis tadi, which means we take some of the amniotic fluid and then we can test it. We can determine the sex and we can do biochemical and enzymatic studies, so that sebelum baby ni lahir lagi kita dah tahu dah whether the baby will be healthy or maybe will have some heart condition ke apa ke. So genetic testing has made this possible. And another method is the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which involves screening embryos for genetic defects. So dia macam ni. So the egg donor is given fertility drugs. So dia diberi drugs untuk kesuburan lah, so that she can produce multiple eggs. So from these multiple eggs, dia akan fertilize to produce embryos. So when embryos are produced, the embryos are analyzed for any genetic defects. And only healthy embryos are injected into uterus. So sebelum dia dilahirkan, dia kita dah screen siap-siap, and then akan dilahirkan baby yang perfect, tak ada masalah genetik. Will that be very good? Will you want that to happen? Best kan kalau sebelum lahir lagi dah tahu dah baby tak ada sakit apa-apa. But then will that be interfering with God's work? Are you actually macam melawan takdir ke apa? What do you think? Okay, so I will leave you with reflections. So taking into consideration of the pros and cons of genetic testing, how do you feel about genetic testing, amniocentesis, pre-implantation, and everything else? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? How do you perceive it? Would you support or oppose to this? And how about from the religion point of view? Do you think it is acceptable? Okay, with that, I end my lecture. That's all, everyone. Thank you very much for bearing with me. See you later. Bye.